Snake's Revenge, the North American exclusive sequel to Metal Gear for the Nintendo Entertainment System, is near universally dismissed and derided because series creator Hideo Kojima was not involved in its development. The question is whether it deserves the hate or is actually a misunderstood gem. I'm Matt from Matt's Retro Room, guest narrating for Makopowered, and welcome to Weekend Rental, where we look at games that, while not classics, or sometimes even good, are still worth examining, and maybe even playing despite themselves. It's almost impossible to discuss Snake's Revenge without going into the history behind it and the Metal Gear series as a whole. So away we go. Metal Gear, developed by Hideo Kojima, was released for the Japanese MSX2 home computer in 1987. In that game, the player takes control of a commando codenamed Solid Snake as he's tasked with infiltrating an installation known as Outer Heaven. Unlike most other military games released by Konami at this time, like, say, Contra, running and gunning is a good way to have your game end quickly. Instead, stealth is the order of the day. The player needs to sneak around, avoiding guards, cameras, and other obstacles and traps. The game was a surprise success in Japan, leading to an English translation for PAL territories later in the year. Snake's Revenge is not a sequel to this game. Instead, it's a sequel to the NES and Famicom port of Metal Gear, released in North America in 1988. The port was not created by Kojima and his team. In fact, it appears that the team tasked with the port was handed the source code for the MSX2 game without the consent of any of the original development team. It's not entirely clear what they did with that source code, though, because the game was kind of a mess. The people behind the ideas in the original weren't there to help translate them to a new platform, so they did not translate well. Areas from the original game were redesigned, generally not for the better. Enemy placement seemed overly chosen to unfairly antagonize the player. New areas were obtuse with no help from the manual, and the poor quality of the English language translation has become legendary. The game was a profitable mess, though, as this would be the only version of Metal Gear that North American audiences would see until 2006, when Metal Gear Solid 3 Subsistence provided players with the proper port of the MSX2 game as a bonus feature. Published under the Ultra Games label, the NES game sold over 1 million units in North America. Seeing these numbers, Konami wanted a sequel as soon as possible. Konami did not, however, call on Kojima to create said sequel, perhaps because he was working on various iterations of Snatcher at the time. And yes, you're seeing that right, there's a chibi version of Snatcher, because why not? Also, because this was a response to the North American success of the game, Snake's Revenge would not actually receive a Japanese release, despite being developed at Konami's Japanese offices. All of this led to the well-known story where Kojima learned about the development of Snake's Revenge while riding the train home from the office with a member of the team working on it, and said member pleaded with him to make the true sequel to Metal Gear. Okay, so Snake's Revenge is a sequel to Metal Gear, but not the canon sequel. It's not even the sequel to the proper Metal Gear. Hideo Kojima did not work on it or even have any input into its creation. Fine. How is it on its own merits, though? Well, to be honest, it's kind of a mess. To be fair, considering the fact that it's a follow-up to the NES port of Metal Gear, which was also kind of a mess, it's not entirely Snake's Revenge's fault. Based on the end credits for both games, it appears that none of the team behind the NES port of Metal Gear worked on Snake's Revenge, which means that Snake's Revenge was likely developed by a third, all-new team. Considering the use of pseudonyms and the poor translations for the game credits from the NES era, though, that's not definitive proof one way or the other. Either way, the game has problems. For one thing, just like the first NES game, Snake's Revenge doesn't care where you're entering the screen from. If you're in the guard's sightline, you're getting spotted. The MSX game actually did move guards, so this wouldn't happen, and the player would have a fair chance to remain hidden. The NES game offered a sort of fix by having it so that alarms ended once the player transitioned to the next screen. Not here, though. Here the alarm continues until you kill all of the alerted guards rushing at you, no matter how many screens you run through. For a game that constantly repopulates enemies, having this sort of persistence just seems mean-spirited. On top of that, the stealth is, let's call it inconsistent. Sight lanes and detection boxes for guards and security cameras are temperamental. For example, here's a point in the playthrough where Snake is literally standing on a guard's head and yet has not been detected. On the opposite side, here are some security cameras which should not be able to see Snake but keep detecting him. Again, and again, and again, and again. Oh, and a quick note about those security cameras. they don't have a blind spot directly underneath them. As soon as sprites overlap, the player is spotted just as surely as if they had run face first into a guard. In fairness, MSX Metal Gear was the same way. It was the NES Metal Gear that actually introduced the idea of blind spots. The pit death traps from Metal Gear are back, and in much greater number. In the NES Metal Gear, they opened slowly enough so you could conceivably dodge them, and were actually expected to do so in one notoriously difficult area of the game. In Snake's Revenge, they're instant death. It would be fine if any of your equipment were capable of detecting traps like, say, the X-ray lens, but nope, instant death. With no way to know they're there ahead of time, it gets really tiresome in the late game areas. Oh, speaking of not being able to detect stuff, there are so many points where the path forward is cryptic and obtuse, much like another Konami game from the same time period, Castlevania II Simon's Quest. Take this instance, where Snake gets a radio message that the entrance to the compound is somewhere on the grounds. What does that mean? Where are the grounds? Is there some other way to detect this entrance? Nope. Instead, there's a building with regenerating plastic explosives, which somehow means that the player is supposed to bomb everything in order to discover the hidden passage under a sandbag. Does the sandbag make a distinct sound when punching it, like false walls? Nope. Why is it under a sandbag instead of part of the wall? Don't worry about it. Even here, though, that's not enough, because the passage is guarded by a dude who fires homing missiles at Snake, only after the entrance has been discovered. In other words, once the player decrypts the obtuse clues, finds the right spot, and figures out the right equipment to access it, they're still likely going to take some unavoidable damage in order to move forward. Unavoidable damage seems to be the running theme in this discussion, and it extends to the bosses as well. Most of the boss encounters seem designed so that the player is forced to take at least some damage during the fight. You can see it in the fight against the attack unit that makes up the first boss, where dodging the attacks is near impossible at first. The fight against John Turner, where the combination of the mines he uses with another pit trap make it hard to avoid the shrapnel thrown from the mines. And then there's the cyborg version of the final boss, whose identity we won't reveal here, but we'll discuss a little bit. So spoiler warning for a 30-year-old game, I guess. The unavoidable damage from the bosses, the ridiculous amount of instant death pit traps, and the issues with stealth detection all feel deliberate, and it's entirely possible that they were. Remember that this game was being developed with a North American audience in mind in 1990. Well, why is that important? Because this is the area of video rental stores. In Japan, the rental of video games was made illegal as of 1984, meaning that, in order to experience a game, you or someone you knew had to buy it outright. In North America, someone could walk into a rental store, rent a game, and beat it in a weekend, and then return it. The publishers would lose that game's sale. As a result, games were intentionally made more difficult for North American audiences. That's why saves were removed from the original Castlevania, well, that and the lack of a Famicom disk system, and that's why the Savannah level of The Lion King is so finicky. That's why auto-aim was removed from the initial release of Resident Evil, and yeah, it's a strong possibility that's why Snake's Revenge is the way it is. Then there are the side-scrolling levels. They're a neat idea in theory. Take the mechanics of Metal Gear and apply them to a more familiar side-scrolling perspective of games like Simon's Quest or Contra. In fact, the side-scrolling sections look uncannily like the NES adaptation of Konami's Russian Attack, one of the unambiguous run-and-gun military games which Kojima himself made Metal Gear to act as an antithesis to. Therein lies the problem. These side-scrolling stages want to keep the stealth gameplay of Metal Gear, but they're designed as though for Russian Attack, which means that there are multiple points where stealth is near impossible. Also, can we talk about the oxygen tanks used in these stages for a minute? Look at how quickly Snake goes through 5 oxygen tanks. How much is he hyperventilating that he can blow through 5 tanks in under 2 minutes? Seriously, let's watch this in real time. Can't breathe. What the heck? Need more oxygen. I need more oxygen. 5 tanks is not enough oxygen. I breathe 5 tanks every night. 5 oxygen tanks. I need at least 20. Even NES Metal Gear recognized that one oxygen tank would take care of a human adult, Snake in this example, for the entirety of his mission. In Snake's Revenge, you need to make sure you are fully stocked up on oxygen tanks wherever you go into a side-scrolling section, because this mechanic is merciless. When you run out of oxygen tanks, the game starts running through the health bar at the same speed. Oh, we also need to talk about some of the problems with representation in this game. First off, hey Konami America, Ultra. Hey Ultra, just because you have a woman on your team and she's a spy doesn't mean you need to refer to her as Foxy anytime you so much as mention her. They do it on the back of the box. In the heading for the second descriptions in the manual, also, can we take a second to appreciate those amazing drawings, and the fact that they seem to have basically swapped the pictures for Snake and JT. Ugh. Basically anywhere where she's mentioned as a character instead of a game mechanic. Oh, sidebar. If overly muscled Snake looks oddly familiar, that's because he is. He is clearly inspired by the poster for the Arnold Schwarzenegger vehicle Commando. What about this mournful close-up at the end of the game? Yep, that's Martin Sheen in Apocalypse Now. There's another equally blatant problem to look at regarding representation, though. Considering Snake's Revenge is a Konami game from the 80s without the involvement of the clearly and vocally anti-war stance Kojima, the unquestioned pro-militarism is kinda to be expected. Okay, fair enough. What's kind of unexpected is the straight-up racism displayed in the enemy design. Let's take a closer look at the standard enemy sprite for the first half of the game. That is clearly a shirtless brown dude wearing a turban with a bandolier strapped across his chest. Wow, that's not even subtle racism there, is it? That design looks like it came right out of Jack Shahian's Real Bad Arabs. That dives into realms of wampum levels of cultural insensitivity. It also gets worse when you take into the account that since this is the stock sprite for enemy soldiers for the first half of the game, that means that Snake, and therefore the player, is going to be killing so many of these racist Hollywood terrorist stereotypes. And we know they're terrorists too, because all of the marketing material for the game goes out of its way to make sure people know that Snake is fighting terrorists. Copyrighted. The print ad for the game shows it in block letter headlines. The manual mentions that they're terrorists so many times. Honestly, I don't know why I was expecting anything different from a game whose marketing decided to name the main villain, who I'm going to get to, I promise, Hayrola Kakameni. Clear parody of a real-world Iranian leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini. And is right up there with Russian Attack in terms of wordplay. Stay classy, 80s Konami. Phew, that's a lot of complaints about Snake's Revenge. So does it do anything right? Yeah, but it takes a bit of work to get at it. First, it's interesting to see how many ideas that show up in later Kojima Helm Metal Gear games make their first appearances here. This is the first time that Snake is sent on a mission with actual equipment, including a knife and a gun. Kojima wouldn't get around doing that until Metal Gear Solid 2, a full 11 years and 3 games later. There's also an interesting risk-reward mechanic at play with the use of the knife. By default, Snake does not have a knife equipped, meaning that he will punch enemies to attack them. This will take multiple hits to dispatch his standard soldier. The knife, on the other hand, can take out an enemy with a single hit. It would seem like common sense that you would just want to stick with the knife throughout the game, right? Not so fast. Yes, the knife takes out enemies with one hit, but there's a drawback to using it exclusively, which you won't even notice if you do so. Enemies will drop items, like rations and ammo, when dispatched, but only if you use your bare hands. Going the apparently easy route using the knife means that items will be in far shorter supply. Then there's the part of the game where Snake needs to infiltrate a freighter ship carrying mass-produced versions of the original Metal Gear design. Not only is this a much more interesting way to get a point in the game to the other, I'm looking at you when I say this, NES Metal Gear trucks, but it also highlights how Metal Gear was always intended to be mass-produced artillery, like tanks or planes. On top of that, it's also an idea that's echoed once again in Metal Gear Solid 2, the entire first portion of the game. Not to mention the infamous demo that came with the Zone of the Enders, as Snake doing almost the exact same thing here in Snake's Revenge. Then there's the plot points, which make appearances in Kojima Metal games much sooner. Oh, that's right, spoilers ahead for 30-year-old games. First, there's the traitor on the team working for the leader of the villainous group, John Turner in Snake's Revenge, and Grey Fox in Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake. Both involve landmines during their boss encounters. Then there's the main villain. Yes, Big Boss makes his return in Metal Gear 2, trying to re-establish Outer Heaven, but guess who did it first? That's right, Snake's Revenge. The whole Hyrule Kakamimi thing was just a smokescreen, and Big Boss is the final enemy of the game. Not only that, but in a twist that hints at both Metal Gear Solid 4 and Metal Gear Rising Revengeance, which will never not be fun to say, it's revealed that Big Boss survived the first game by being turned into a decidedly Robocop-esque cyborg, but is definitely not Robocop. Nope, not Robocop whatsoever. Don't ask me why the cyborg version of Big Boss is bigger than when he was wearing his skin suit though, because for that, I got nothing. Oh, and it needs to be pointed out that Snake's Revenge is also the first time North American players actually face a Metal Gear. The only thing players dealt with at the end of the NES Metal Gear was a supercomputer, with a specific sequence of plastic explosives that needed to be followed in order to defeat it. Not exactly high-tension climax there. Here, though, the player has to destroy an actual Metal Gear before it launches its nuclear payload. You know, the threat that was behind the plots of all the games in the series. Snake's Revenge is a mishmash of interesting ideas, inconsistent mechanics, and problematic representation, and its attempts of humor are pathetic. Its gameplay wildly facilitates between inspired, insipid, unfair, and unintelligible, which makes it hard to recommend in the modern era. Between the dated and sometimes broken mechanics, the unquestioning pro-military stance, and the representation issues in the marketing materials and the game itself, it is fully understandable if you cannot bring yourself to play it nowadays. There might be enough interesting ideas here though to make it a good weekend rental, but at least it's not Metal Gear Survive.